CEO snubs black investor. 5 minutes later, $3.3 billion in funding disappears. The ballroom was a symphony of polished marble and gleaming chandeliers, filled with the sound of clinking glasses and hushed conversations. The air was thick with ambition as 300 of the most powerful investors in the world gathered at the Westbrook Hotel's grand ballroom. Every chair was occupied by someone who believed they had earned their place. But in the center of it all, the man at the podium had already captured their attention, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. Griffin Stroud, CEO of Stroud Dynamics, stood at the center of the room, commanding the attention of the crowd with his silver hair perfectly styled and a smile that radiated practiced confidence. He was everything a powerful CEO should be. Tall, impeccably dressed, and never missing a beat. He spoke about the future, about how his company was about to revolutionize the tech industry, about the new partnerships that would change the world. His words were smooth, calculated. The crowd responded with polite applause, their faces eager, waiting for more. But then, as Griffin's speech began to wind down, something unexpected happened. "Before I wrap up, I'd like to introduce someone who will be joining our executive team," Griffin continued, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 successful deals. "A man whose expertise in global finance and disruption will take Stroud Dynamics to new heights." Darius Langston, a man in his mid-40s, stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a sharp, understated black suit, he had the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce his wealth or success. His presence, though understated, had a ripple effect. He had built an empire of his own, not through media attention, but through strategic investments and patience. His business portfolio spanned continents, and his name was known in the highest circles, though he preferred to keep his face out of the tabloids. He was a man of action, not words. Griffin, oblivious to the simmering tension in the room, gestured toward Darius, inviting him to the stage. The crowd began to murmur, some out of genuine curiosity, others with the self-interest of those who wanted to make the right connections. But then it happened. Darius Langston, calm and collected as ever, made his way to the front. His hand, outstretched in the age-old gesture of greeting, was met with a deliberate turn of Griffin's head. The CEO didn't look at him, didn't shake his hand. Instead, he adjusted the microphone stand, pretending to be distracted. The hand that had been offered sat suspended in the air, frozen. The crowd grew still, watching the exchange, their eyes darting between the two men. For a moment, it seemed like a simple mistake. Maybe Griffin hadn't seen the handshake. Maybe he had been too focused on the microphone. Maybe it was a lapse in timing. But the truth was far more deliberate. Griffin Stroud, in that split second, had refused to acknowledge Darius Langston, his power, his success, and the control he held over the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Darius did not flinch. He did not react. His hand slowly dropped, his face still as impassive as ever. The moment passed in an instant, but its impact would echo for much longer. Griffin, sensing the shift in the room, quickly recovered. He flashed a smile, turning back to the crowd, his voice smooth as ever. "Darius Langston brings exceptional expertise to our team," he said, his tone as rehearsed as the rest of his speech. "His insight will be invaluable as we continue to expand our global initiatives." The applause was polite, but the tension in the room was palpable. What should have been a moment of triumphant announcement had instead become a social disaster, a public display of disregard for someone who, unbeknownst to Griffin, was far more than just an investor. Darius Langston had known it would come to this. He had anticipated it, planned for it. He knew Griffin would never see him as an equal, not in the way that the world should. He had worked too long, too hard, to be dismissed by someone like Griffin Stroud. But the refusal to shake his hand wasn't just about ego. It was about power. Griffin Stroud had just made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated Darius Langston. The cameras captured every second, and soon the clip was all over social media. Phones buzzed as people shared the moment. It was a subtle snub, one that could easily be dismissed as a mistake. But the world didn't see it that way. The backlash was immediate. Griffin's reputation began to tarnish. The narrative was set, and there was no turning back. Within 5 minutes of the handshake debacle, something even more devastating was happening behind the scenes. Darius had orchestrated the perfect response, an invisible, calculated move that was already in motion. Darius Langston was a man of action, and now the consequences of Griffin's arrogance were beginning to unfold. As the event continued, the attention shifted back to Griffin, but something had changed. Behind the facade of success, something had cracked. Darius wasn't just another investor. He was a force, and Griffin had just given him the fuel he needed. By the time the night ended, $3.3 billion in funding, money that Griffin had counted on to keep his empire running, had disappeared. In a single stroke, Darius had outmaneuvered Griffin. He had called in favors, leveraged connections, and pulled strings with the precision of a seasoned strategist. The funding was no longer available, and the entire world would soon know that Griffin Stroud had just sealed his fate. The cameras had caught the snub, but what they didn't catch was the moment Griffin lost everything, the reckoning. The hum of the Westbrook Hotel's grand ballroom had barely faded when the damage was already done. Darius Langston, a man who had never sought attention, now found the world's gaze squarely fixed on him. It was an odd feeling, one he had anticipated but never truly experienced. Griffin Stroud, with all his wealth and power, had made a grave error, and Darius would make sure the world knew it. The moment the clip of Griffin's snub hit social media, the ripple effect began. Within minutes, his name was trending, but not for the reasons Griffin had hoped. The video, slowed down and analyzed by millions, revealed more than just a simple handshake gone wrong. It exposed a vulnerability in Griffin's empire, one that Darius had spent years preparing to exploit. As Darius stepped into the sleek confines of his downtown penthouse, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Griffin Stroud had just made his first mistake, and it was one that would cost him dearly. Darius dropped his briefcase on the polished hardwood floor and moved to the glass window, staring out at the city skyline. The lights glittered below him, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. The calm exterior was merely a facade, a mask he'd perfected over the years. But behind those cool eyes lay a fire that had been stoked for decades. He picked up his phone, glancing at the dozens of notifications that had flooded in. Some were from journalists, others from friends and allies who had seen the video and knew exactly what it meant. There was no question. This was just the beginning. He opened the thread from Naomi Clark, a trusted ally who had been by his side through much of this. She was a powerful figure in her own right, a woman who had risked everything to bring Darius to the table. Darius had always known that the fight ahead would require more than just money. It would require strategic thinking, alliances, and a firm resolve. He typed a quick response. "The stage is set. Let's proceed with Phase 1. Darius wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, people listened. He had spent years quietly positioning himself as a force in the global market. His success wasn't by chance. It was the result of meticulous planning and an unwavering commitment to his vision of justice. Now it was time to put that vision into action. Across the city, Naomi Clark stood at the window of her luxury apartment, the same video playing repeatedly on her phone. Griffin Stroud's refusal to shake Darius's hand had ignited a firestorm, but the snub wasn't just personal, it was political. And in her world, politics were everything. Naomi had made a decision long ago to align herself with Darius, and now that decision was about to bear fruit. She knew the risks. Griffin had more power, more connections, and more resources than anyone could imagine. But Naomi also knew that he had grown complacent, arrogant even. He had underestimated the quiet storm that was Darius Langston. Her phone buzzed again. It was Walter Kane, Griffin's PR director. "Have you seen the clip?" Walter's voice was tight with panic. "Of course," Naomi replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Everyone has. We need a statement from Darius, something conciliatory. Griffin is demanding one, but we have to spin this. We can't let this escalate." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Spinning won't work." "Not this time. Darius isn't just an investor. He's a force of nature. He's already made his move." Walter's voice dropped to a whisper. "What do you mean?" Naomi paused for a moment, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of her desk. "Phase 1 has already begun. Trust me, this is just the beginning." She ended the call without waiting for a response. The wheels were already in motion. Griffin Stroud had underestimated Darius, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Naomi knew what was coming next, an avalanche of corporate failures, financial turmoil, and a media frenzy that would shake Stroud Dynamics to its core. At the same time, Griffin Stroud sat in his corner office, his face flushed with anger. The video of his refusal to shake Darius's hand had gone viral in the worst possible way. The snub had been accidental, or so he told himself, but the world didn't see it that way. They saw a man in power dismissing a fellow executive, a man who had already begun to show cracks in his empire. Griffin had always been careful, always controlled. But now, sitting in his office, he felt a creeping sense of panic. The calls from his board members were relentless. They demanded explanations, reassurances, and worse, the stock price of Stroud Dynamics had begun to drop. Fast. He slammed his fist on the desk. "Who the hell leaked that video?" he muttered, his voice low but seething with rage. "Sir, we've traced the leaks," Walter Kane said, his voice tinged with nervousness as he stepped into the office. "But it's not just the video. There's been a concerted effort to destabilize us. We've lost $3.3 billion in funding already." Griffin's eyes widened. "What do you mean, lost funding?" "Anonymous investors pulled their support. Some of our largest backers have quietly withdrawn their capital. We've already seen a shift in the markets. It's happening faster than we can manage." Griffin stood up, his pulse quickening. "This is a fucking attack." "Who's behind it?" "It's Darius Langston," Walter said, his voice low and almost apologetic. Griffin's face twisted with disbelief. "Langston? He's just an investor, a nobody who got lucky. This is ridiculous." But Walter's silence was all the answer Griffin needed. Darius Langston sat quietly in his penthouse, staring at the skyline. He had no need for the headlines, the media, or the attention, but he knew that the moment Griffin's empire began to crumble, the world would take notice. He had set the trap, and now it was time to watch it unfold. Darius wasn't just dismantling a corporate empire. He was dismantling a system. The system that had allowed men like Griffin Stroud to thrive while the world suffered. He had spent years quietly amassing power, not for wealth, but for justice. And now, with one gesture, one simple refusal to shake hands, Griffin had unwittingly given Darius everything he needed. The game was on, and Griffin, in his arrogance, had just sealed his own fate. Back in the Westbrook Hotel, the evening ended in a haze of whispers and gossip. The investors mingled, the deals continued, but the snub was still fresh in their minds. It was the moment that would change everything. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now the spark that would ignite a firestorm. The world was watching, and Darius Langston was ready to make his move. The tipping point. The atmosphere in the Stroud boardroom was suffocating. Griffin Stroud stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face a mask of calm, but inside his mind raced. The video of him snubbing Darius Langston's handshake had gone viral, and the ripple effects were far more damaging than he had ever anticipated. The stock price had taken a dive, and $3.3 billion in funding had evaporated in mere minutes. His fingers tightened around the glass of water in front of him, but he said nothing. Across the table, his board members sat in tense silence, their eyes shifting uncomfortably from one to another, clearly uneasy but unwilling to speak. The door clicked open, and Walter Kane, the company's PR director, entered with a hurried pace, holding a tablet in his hand. "Griffin," Walter began, his voice tight, "we need to act fast. The damage control team is working overtime, but we don't have much time." "Damage control?" Griffin muttered, shaking his head. "How do you fix this, Walter? How do you spin a simple snub into a victory?" Walter sighed. "We can't spin it. We can only try to manage the fallout. I've reached out to our major investors, but they're all demanding answers. Some have already pulled out. If we don't contain this quickly, we might lose more than just our reputation." The room was heavy with the weight of Griffin's realization. He had underestimated Darius Langston, and that mistake was now unraveling everything he had built. He had been dismissive of Darius, thinking he was just another black investor looking for a quick deal. He had never considered that the man standing before him in that conference room would have such a long-term strategy, one that went beyond money. It was personal for Darius. Griffin could see that now. "Get him on the phone," Griffin snapped, his voice cold. "Now." Walter hesitated, but quickly nodded and made the call. As Griffin turned away, his mind wandered back to the summit just days before. The way Darius had extended his hand, only to be met with Griffin's deliberate dismissal. The moment felt almost surreal now, like an orchestrated play designed to bring Griffin down. As the phone rang, Walter looked at Griffin, his face lined with worry. "We need to get ahead of this, Griffin. The narrative has already shifted. If we don't act, we'll lose everything." Griffin waved him off. "We'll deal with it. I'll make it right. Just get him to speak to me, now." The line clicked, and Walter held the phone up to his ear, his brow furrowing as the call connected. Griffin stood with his back to the table, waiting, the tension in the room palpable. Seconds ticked by before Walter spoke again. "Mr. Langston, thank you for taking the time. We're aware of the situation, and Griffin would like to address this personally. He's ready to—" The words cut off as Griffin spun around, snatching the phone from Walter's hand, his voice growing louder as he spoke. "Darius, it's Griffin. We need to clear the air. There's been a misunderstanding, and I want to fix it." A brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Darius's voice, calm but filled with an unsettling certainty. "You've made your point, Griffin, but it's too late for apologies. I gave you a chance and you blew it. The game has already changed." Griffin's heart pounded. The arrogance, the dismissiveness that had once defined him was slipping away. Darius wasn't just an investor, he was a force, one that Griffin couldn't control or manipulate. Griffin clenched his jaw, trying to maintain composure. "You can't just throw everything away because of a handshake," Griffin said, his voice strained. "I'll make this right. I'll apologize publicly, whatever it takes." Darius let out a soft chuckle. "I'm afraid it's already too late for that, Griffin. You've shown the world who you really are, and now they're watching. The foundation you built your empire on is crumbling, and you have no one to blame but yourself." Griffin's eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me, Langston? Name it, and it's yours." There was a long pause before Darius spoke again, his voice steady and deliberate. "What I want, Griffin, is not for sale. What you've built is rotten. The people around you, the lies you've told, they're all going to come out, and you'll have no one to blame but your own arrogance." Griffin's grip tightened on the phone. "You're making a mistake, Darius. Don't think you can take me down. Darius's voice was calm but laced with quiet power. The mistake was yours, Griffin. I'm not here to take you down. I'm here to bring the truth to light. And when the truth comes out, you'll have no choice but to face the consequences. The line went dead, leaving Griffin standing there, staring at the phone in his hand. The reality of the situation was setting in. Darius wasn't bluffing. He had prepared for this moment for years, and Griffin had made the first misstep in what was about to be a full-scale takeover. As Darius set the phone down on the desk, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The first phase was complete. Griffin Stroud had no idea what was coming next. His attention shifted to the window, overlooking the city. The world was buzzing with news of the scandal, but for Darius, it was just another step in a much larger plan. He had carefully positioned himself, aligned with the right people, and built an empire that was ready to reshape the corporate landscape. What started as a personal vendetta, his father's wrongful conviction, had evolved into something far bigger. This was about justice, about exposing the corruption that ran deep within the system. He glanced at the papers spread across his desk, financial reports, legal documents, contracts, all part of the blueprint he had created. Griffin's empire was crumbling, and now Darius had the power to control what came next. The world would watch as the mighty Stroud dynasty was dismantled, piece by piece. And at the center of it all stood Darius Langston, calm, collected, and ready to take what was rightfully his. The room was silent except for the sound of Darius's steady breathing. He could hear the echoes of his grandmother's words in his mind. Power is never given, it's taken. It had taken him decades to get to this point, but now that he was here, there was no turning back. He reached for his phone once more, texting Naomi. Prepare for phase 2. It's time. Across the city, Naomi Clark read the message and nodded to herself. She knew exactly what it meant. The battle had just begun, and with Darius leading the charge, they would win. The game was shifting. And Griffin Stroud, for all his wealth and power, was no longer in control. The storm unleashed. The next few days were a blur of activity, filled with tense meetings, countless phone calls, and strategic moves designed to contain the fallout. Griffin Stroud had never imagined that one seemingly minor act of arrogance, a simple refusal to shake Darius Langston's hand, would have such catastrophic consequences. Yet here he was, cornered in his own fortress, trying to salvage what was left of his empire. He paced restlessly around his office, his mind consumed with frustration and disbelief. The news coverage of the summit debacle had exploded, reaching millions in record time. The video of the snub had become a viral sensation. Social media was ablaze, tearing into him with unforgiving venom. Analysts and pundits had dissected the moment, some calling it a microaggression, others simply marking it as a reflection of Griffin's deeper, unspoken prejudices. But regardless of the framing, one thing was undeniable. Griffin was losing control of the narrative. Walter Caney, his PR director, had been working overtime, trying to undo the damage. But Griffin could see the cracks in the foundation widening. Investors were pulling out. Business partners were getting cold feet. His advisors were scrambling to contain the chaos, but each move seemed to make things worse. Griffin's phone buzzed with another incoming call from the board. The sheer number of calls was maddening. They were pressuring him for answers, demanding that he take immediate action to reverse the damage. He answered the phone with a strained sigh, knowing what to expect. "Griffin," came the voice of Richard Mills, one of the more influential board members. "We need to talk. The investors are livid." "The stock is plummeting. This is bigger than you think. We need a plan." Griffin's voice came out clipped, barely holding back the anger. "I know, Richard, I'm handling it. Just give me a little more time." "That's not enough," Richard shot back. "The board is meeting tomorrow. You need to address this. If we don't see action soon, some of us might have to consider stepping down. You're losing our trust. Griffin's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not losing anyone's trust. I've built this company from the ground up. They can't just abandon me now. They already are, Griffin, Richard replied coldly. We need to act fast, or this could be the end of Strayau Dynamics. The call ended with a dead silence, leaving Griffin alone in the vast, sterile confines of his office. He stood at the window, watching as the city bustled below, oblivious to the storm brewing in his company. Meanwhile, Darius Langston was several steps ahead. While Griffin scrambled to put out fires, Darius was quietly consolidating power, inching closer to his ultimate goal. It was strange, almost too easy. After all, it wasn't just about exposing Griffin's shortcomings. It was about setting a new course for the future. Darius had planned every detail meticulously, and now that the pieces were in motion, he could almost feel the inevitable conclusion drawing near. Darius sat in his office, the sleek minimalist decor mirroring his own calm demeanor. His fingers hovered over his keyboard as he read through another update from Victor Reed, his trusted right-hand man. The message was short, but crucial. Phase 1 complete. Moving forward with Phase 2. Victor was the key. While Darius made headlines for his quiet authority and calculated moves, it was Victor who had been gathering information, building alliances, and positioning assets. Together, they had infiltrated the corporate system, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with Griffin cornered, they had everything they needed to bring him down. The phone buzzed on Darius's desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Naomi Clark, the woman who had once been Griffin's star recruit, and now, Darius hoped, an ally. He answered the call with his usual calm tone. Naomi, Darius greeted. How's the situation on your end? I've been trying to reach Griffin, but he's avoiding my calls, Naomi said, her voice tinged with frustration. The board is demanding action. He's retreating into his own world as usual. I'm getting sick of trying to fix his messes. Darius leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. He had been anticipating this. Naomi was Griffin's right-hand woman for years, and now she was beginning to see the cracks in the system. It's not just his mess, Darius replied. It's ours now, but that's why we're here, Naomi. We can rebuild from the wreckage. We just need to be strategic. I know, Naomi said, but I'm starting to wonder if this company can be saved. How much more can we clean up? Darius exhaled slowly. You don't have to save it all, just the parts that matter. The rest... He paused. The rest we burn down. As Naomi hung up, Darius felt a sense of finality. The endgame was in motion, and Griffin's time at the top was running out. The world would soon know the full extent of his corruption, and the people who had suffered because of it would have their justice. But there was something else, something deeper that gnawed at Darius's thoughts. He had come to terms with his father's wrongful conviction, but he could never erase the scar it had left. Every move he made now, every victory he secured, was a tribute to his father's legacy. And yet, despite the power he had accumulated, Darius couldn't help but feel that it wasn't enough. The truth, for all its power, was still a shadow. It had to be more than just revenge. It had to be a new foundation for something better. For once, Darius Langston had the chance to reshape the world on his terms. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for the future. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Victor stepped in, holding a thick file in his hands. It's time, Victor said. We have the final piece. The deal is set. Let's end this. Darius stood, his expression hardening with determination. Let's do it. Together they would bring Griffin down, piece by piece. But Darius wasn't just after Griffin's empire. He was after something bigger. He was going to take the system itself down and rebuild it from the ground up. And as he walked toward the door, he knew that this was only the beginning. The first phase had been completed. The storm was about to break, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the city continued to hum with life, oblivious to the power struggle that was unfolding behind closed doors. In the distance, the skyline gleamed, a symbol of wealth and ambition. But for Darius Langston, it was something else entirely. It was the future. And it was his to shape. The quiet revolution. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Griffin Stroud, once the uncontested king of industry, stood at the head of the table, his usual confident posture now faltering under the weight of the latest news. His empire, the one he had built from the ground up, was crumbling around him, piece by piece. "Gentlemen, ladies," Griffin began, his voice hoarse, "I need you to trust me. This is a temporary setback. We've been through worse. We will come out stronger." His eyes flicked to the faces of the board members, the once loyal allies, now just a sea of uncertainty. They had seen the reports. They had heard the allegations. The SEC investigation was no longer a whisper. It was a public spectacle, and the press was circling like vultures, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Victor Reed stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, watching with a mixture of disdain and indifference. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Griffin's influence would be irrevocably shattered. He had always known that Darius Langston would be the one to bring this empire down, but now he could feel the tectonic shift beneath his feet. "Griffin," Richard Mills, one of the board members, spoke up, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "This is more than a minor setback. We're talking about an audit of your entire career, years of business practices, deals, acquisitions, everything. We can't ignore this." Griffin shot him a look, his jaw clenched. "I built this company, Richard. I am this company. You don't turn your back on me now." But his words lacked the conviction they once held. The walls were closing in, and the room grew colder with every passing second. Griffin's usual swagger was nowhere to be found. The truth was simple. The man who had once held all the cards had now lost his hand. Darius Langston's name had been on everyone's lips for the last 48 hours. The press was buzzing with every little detail of Griffin's refusal to shake Darius's hand and the subsequent fallout. What had seemed like a minor mistake, an unremarkable moment at the summit, had exploded into a full-blown crisis. And in the midst of it all, Darius stood unshaken, calm, his every move measured and calculated. Across the city, Naomi Clark was feeling the weight of the situation too. She had seen the reports, the viral videos. She had watched the way the press had latched onto the story, and she knew that the narrative was shifting. She had vouched for Griffin, brought him Darius, but now she could feel the dissonance between what she believed in and the reality unfolding before her. She sat at her desk in her office at Stroud, her fingers tracing the edges of a document she had been asked to finalize for the board. The company's future hung in the balance, and she was trapped between loyalty to Griffin, whom she had worked with for years, and the undeniable truth of what was happening. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. "Naomi, it's time!" came the voice on the other end. It was Darius. Naomi felt a chill run through her. "I know," she said softly. "I'm on my way." As Naomi arrived at Darius's office, the atmosphere had shifted. She had been expecting a tense confrontation, but what she found was a calm determination. Darius sat behind his desk, his eyes sharp and focused, as if nothing had changed at all. "I knew this day would come," he said as she entered, his voice steady. Griffin's empire was built on lies and manipulation. It was only a matter of time before the cracks started to show. Naomi hesitated before sitting down. "But how do we fix it? How do we move forward? Darius leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. The first step is understanding that the system itself needs to change. It's not just about Griffin. It's about everything he built, the way power is distributed, the way decisions are made. It's all wrong, and it's time to make it right. Naomi watched him closely, a mix of admiration and disbelief in her eyes. She had known Darius for years, but this was different. This was not the man who had come to the table for a simple partnership. This was the man who had been quietly plotting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. "You're talking about a complete overhaul," she said, almost incredulously. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Darius smiled. "We don't have a choice. This isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. We need to dismantle the old system and rebuild it from the ground up." As the days passed, Naomi found herself more and more drawn into Darius's vision. What had started as a moment of personal revenge had evolved into something much more significant. The plan was taking shape, piece by piece, and it wasn't just about taking down Griffin. It was about rewriting the rules of corporate America. Meanwhile, Griffin's world continued to unravel. The SEC investigation was expanding, and his personal life was becoming a matter of public record. He had been caught in a web of lies and corruption that had been carefully constructed over decades, and now it was all crashing down. His phone rang again, and he hesitated before answering. "Griffin," Walter Kane's voice came through the line. "We need to talk. The board is meeting again, and they're losing faith." "They're ready to cut ties with you." Griffin slammed his fist onto his desk, the sound echoing through the empty room. "No one is cutting ties with me. They'll come around." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. The foundations of his empire were crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The next day, Darius stood in front of a small group of investors, the room filled with people who had once been loyal to Griffin. The tension was thick, palpable. But Darius didn't feel it. He had planned for this moment. He had studied every move, every decision Griffin had ever made. And now, it was time to take control. "I know why you're all here," Darius began, his voice firm and commanding. "You've watched as Griffin's empire has crumbled. You've seen the lies, the corruption, and now you have a choice. You can continue down this path, or you can join me in building something better." The investors exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of Darius's words. But slowly, one by one, they began to nod. This was the moment of change they had been waiting for. The old guard was being swept away, and a new era was dawning. As the week wore on, the fallout from Griffin's refusal to shake Darius's hand continued to spread like wildfire. Media outlets were picking up the story, and the pressure on Griffin was mounting. But he refused to back down. His pride, his arrogance, wouldn't let him admit defeat. And so, the stage was set. The pieces were in place, and the final act of this drama was ready to unfold. Darius Langston had patiently waited for this moment, and now he was about to claim the victory that had been a lifetime in the making. The storm was coming, and it would change everything. The reckoning. The sound of the boardroom door slamming echoed through the halls of Striao Dynamics like a gunshot, signaling the end of an era. Griffin Stroud sat at the head of the table, his face pale, sweat collecting at his brow. His once imposing figure now seemed small and desperate in the shadow of what was unfolding. The room was filled with silence, the weight of what was happening pressing down on everyone like a suffocating cloud. For the first time in years, Griffin was powerless. The sense of control he had wielded for decades, the control that had once made him feel invincible, was now slipping through his fingers. And he knew it. "We're not talking about just a few bad investments," Victor Reed said. his voice smooth but carrying the weight of years of dissatisfaction. "This is about systematic corruption, Griffin. It's been going on for too long. You've sold out everything you claim to value. The numbers don't lie." Victor stood at the far end of the table, his gaze steady, unwavering. He had been Griffin's right-hand man for years, the one who had helped keep the empire standing, even when it was teetering on the edge of destruction. But now, Victor was part of the reckoning. He had helped to build the machine, but now he was part of tearing it down. Griffin clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "You don't understand, Victor," he said, his voice low but filled with menace. "This company is mine. I built it. It was my vision that made Strayout Dynamics what it is today. You can't just tear it down." But Victor's expression remained unchanged. "I'm not tearing it down, Griffin. I'm taking it apart, piece by piece, because it was built on lies. You've used people, manipulated them, crushed them under your foot. And now, the truth is coming out." Naomi Clark, who had been standing silently near the back of the room, stepped forward. Her eyes were sharp, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Griffin. "You thought you could control everything, that you could keep everyone in line with your money and power," she said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. "But now you're facing something you can't buy your way out of, the truth." Griffin's face contorted in fury, but he remained silent. He was a man backed into a corner, and he knew it. But what he didn't know was how far Naomi had gone, what she had uncovered. "You can't hide behind your money anymore," Naomi continued. "Darius Langston has turned the tables. He's already positioned himself to take over, and the moment you refuse to shake his hand..." Griffin's eyes flickered with anger. "You're one of them now too, aren't you?" he spat. "You've always been a pawn in their game. This was never about me. It's always been about them, hasn't it?" Naomi stood her ground, unflinching. "This is about more than just you, Griffin. This is about systemic corruption. It's about the people who've been crushed under the weight of your empire. And now, it's about the future. A future that doesn't rely on people like you." For a moment, the room was silent. Griffin's mouth opened as if to retort, but nothing came out. The walls had come crashing down around him, and he was no longer the king of his empire. He was just a man who had spent years exploiting others, and now the consequences of his actions were finally catching up to him. Darius Langston's words rang in his ears. "Power is never given, it's taken." Griffin had built his empire on the backs of others, using their labor and loyalty to secure his own wealth and status. But now he was learning the hard way that the people he had used were no longer afraid. The door opened again, and one of Griffin's senior executives walked in, a look of concern etched on his face. "Sir," the man said, his voice tight. "We've just received news from the SEC. They're preparing to seize all your assets. Your accounts have been frozen." Griffin's face drained of color. "What do you mean? This can't be happening. I built this empire." Naomi stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with a sense of finality. "It's happening, Griffin. You're not untouchable. You never were." Across town, Darius Langston sat in his penthouse, watching the news unfold on his television screen. The camera zoomed in on Griffin's face, now a picture of desperation, as he tried to explain away the mounting evidence against him. Darius felt no satisfaction, no joy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something bigger. He turned to Victor Reed, who was sitting across the room, his expression thoughtful. "It's all falling apart," Darius said, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "But we still have work to do." Victor nodded. "This is only the beginning. The real change comes after." Darius leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The world was watching, waiting for the final act to unfold, and he knew that this wasn't just about Griffin. It was about the system. About the way the rich and powerful had held all the cards for so long. It was about dismantling that system, piece by piece. "There's a lot of work to do," Darius said, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "But we can't afford to waste any more time." Back in the Stroud boardroom, the walls seemed to close in on Griffin as the room buzzed with whispers. The board members, who had once followed his every command, now exchanged worried glances. The SEC investigation was moving fast, and the mounting pressure was too much for them to ignore. They had been loyal to Griffin for years, but loyalty had its limits. Richard Mills, the senior board member, stood up and addressed the room. "We have to make a decision. The company can't survive much longer like this. We either cut ties with Griffin or risk losing everything." Griffin's eyes flicked to Richard, his gaze cold. "You don't know what you're saying," he muttered. "This company is mine. It's always been mine." But Richard's voice was firm. "You've betrayed us, Griffin. And now we have to decide whether to stand with you or do what's best for the company." The silence in the room was deafening. Griffin's empire had begun to crumble, and there was no one left who would stand in his corner. His grip on power had slipped, and no amount of money or influence could change that. As Griffin's world continued to unravel, Naomi found herself facing her own battle. The changes she had been pushing for at Stroud were beginning to take shape, but it was not going to be easy. She had been targeted by Griffin's supporters, those who still believed in the old ways, and the pressure was mounting. But Naomi was not afraid. She had come this far, and she was not going to back down now. The company needed change, and she was determined to make sure that change came. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "No matter the cost." Victor nodded in agreement. "We've come this far. Now, we finish it." Darius's phone rang, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his expression unreadable. "It's time," came the voice on the other end. "We're ready for the next step." Darius stood up, his gaze sharp. "Let's make it happen." The final chapter was about to be written. The stage was set, and the players were in position. Griffin's empire was crumbling, and the people who had once been beneath his thumb were now rising up to take what was rightfully theirs. This was not just about a refusal to shake a hand. It was about something much bigger. Something that would change the course of history. And Darius Langston was ready to see it through. The fall and rise. The city skyline outside Darius Langston's penthouse gleamed under the fading light of a summer evening. But Darius wasn't looking at the view. His eyes were fixed on the large screen mounted on the far wall, displaying a live stream of the press conference taking place at the downtown Marriott. Griffin Stroud, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and confusion, stood before the sea of reporters, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. "It's not just about business, is it?" Darius murmured to himself. He knew this wasn't just about a corporate snub. Griffin's refusal to shake his hand was merely the spark that ignited a much deeper fire. What Griffin had done, that moment of calculated dismissal, had exposed something far more dangerous. A man with so much power could afford to make enemies, but he could never afford to let his arrogance blind him to the true cost of his actions. The camera zoomed in on Griffin's face, and Darius saw the exact moment his composure began to crack. The questions from reporters were getting sharper, more pointed. They were asking about the SEC investigation, about the discrepancies in his company's financial reports, about the leaks to the media. With every question, Griffin's defenses weakened, and the man who had once been invincible in the corporate world was now struggling to maintain control. Darius sat back, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. He knew the plan was working. The evidence was in place. The truth was out there for the world to see, and Griffin's empire was crumbling. But Darius also knew that the real work wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in the headquarters of Stroud Dynamics, Naomi Clark was watching the press conference unfold on her office screen. She'd never seen Griffin so vulnerable. For years, she had been his confidant, his ally, the one person he relied on to help him navigate the rough waters of corporate strategy. But now, with his empire falling apart, Naomi was beginning to question everything she had believed in. She had always known that Griffin wasn't the man he appeared to be, but the revelations now spilling out into the public were worse than she had ever imagined. The falsified environmental reports, the manipulation of diversity metrics, the unethical practices that had allowed Stroud Dynamics to thrive, it was all coming to light. And Naomi was at the heart of it, a key player in the game that was now unraveling. "Can you imagine what he's feeling right now?" Victor Reed asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Naomi glanced up at him. Victor had been by her side for years, a trusted confidant and advisor, but even he seemed uneasy now. "I know exactly what he's feeling," Naomi replied, her voice flat. "But it's not about him anymore, Victor. It's about the future. It's about rebuilding everything that he destroyed." Victor nodded slowly. "So, what's next? How far do we go?" Naomi stood up, her eyes focused on the screen. "We go all the way. We take down the system he built piece by piece, and we don't stop until every last vestige of it is gone." Back in the Stroud boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The air was thick with the weight of the decisions being made, the future of the company hanging in the balance. The board members were divided, some still loyal to Griffin, others seeing the writing on the wall. Richard Mills, a longtime ally of Griffin, was speaking now, his voice low and urgent. "We can't just abandon him," Richard said, his face tight with the strain of the situation. "Griffin built this company. His vision has been the backbone of this business for decades. We can't throw him to the wolves now." But another board member, Ellen Garrison, shook her head. "We have no choice, Richard. Look at the evidence. The SEC is investigating. The press is on us. If we don't act, we're going down with him. We have to distance ourselves from Griffin, and we have to do it fast." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Griffin had been the face of Stroud Dynamics, but now that face was tarnished, and no one knew how much longer they could protect him. Naomi Clark had made it clear that she was ready to take charge, to steer the company into a new direction. But the question was, would the board let her, or would they try to protect Griffin for as long as possible? Richard's voice broke the silence. "If we do this, we'll lose everything. The trust, the reputation, the stability. We'll be starting from scratch." Ellen looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "We've already lost everything. It's just a matter of admitting it." As the board meeting dragged on, Griffin sat in his office, staring out the window, his mind racing. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The press conference had been a disaster, and now the board was turning against him. His only allies were disappearing one by one, and all that remained was the bitter realization that he had no one to blame but himself. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Walter Caney, his PR director. Griffin quickly opened it, reading the terse words that appeared on the screen. "We need to act fast. The board is already discussing a vote of no confidence. We can't afford to wait any longer." Griffin slammed the phone down, the anger surging through him. "No," he muttered under his breath. "I won't go down like this." He stood up and paced the room, his thoughts racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to take control of the narrative again, to fight back against the mounting tide of accusations and investigations. But as the seconds ticked by, Griffin realized something. The more he tried to fight it, the deeper he sank into the hole he had dug for himself. Meanwhile, Darius Langston was making the final preparations for the next phase of his plan. He had worked for years to get to this point, carefully positioning himself and his allies within the right circles. His wealth and influence had given him the power to shape the world of business, but it was his meticulous planning and unwavering focus on justice that had brought him to the moment where he could finally take down someone like Griffin Stroud. He stood in front of the massive windows of his penthouse, watching as the sun set over the city. The world was changing, and he was leading the charge. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. It was Victor. "It's happening," Victor said when Darius answered. "The board is finally moving. They've already called the vote." Darius didn't smile. He didn't need to. "And what's their decision?" Victor's voice was quiet but filled with tension. "They're going to do it. They're going to cut ties with Griffin." Darius nodded slowly. This was it. The moment he had worked for had finally arrived. "I'll be there in an hour," Darius said, his voice steady and confident. "Let's finish this." As Darius made his way to the meeting, the sense of finality was palpable. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for. He had endured the years of watching his father suffer, knowing that the system was rigged against him. Now Darius was about to dismantle that system piece by piece. He wasn't doing it for revenge. He was doing it for justice. And as he walked through the doors of the boardroom, he knew that this was only the beginning. Griffin's fall was just the first step. The true work of rebuilding had yet to begin. The final blow. The morning after the storm had hit, the world was quieter, as if holding its breath in anticipation. The news had spread like wildfire. Griffin Stroud's empire was crumbling, and with it, the man who had once seemed invincible. His name, once synonymous with wealth and power, was now a symbol of corruption and downfall. The investors, the board members, the press, all of them had witnessed his arrogance, his greed, his refusal to own up to his mistakes. Inside his once majestic office, now eerily silent, Griffin sat hunched over his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he read the news reports. His empire was on the verge of collapse. The SEC investigation had turned its focus squarely on him. His reputation, carefully crafted over decades, had been shattered in a matter of weeks. Every move he had made in his career, every deal he had ever closed, was now under scrutiny. He could feel the weight of his own failures pressing down on him, crushing him in ways no amount of wealth could ever have protected him from. Outside his office, Naomi Clark stood at the door, watching him. She had seen this man at his peak, surrounded by sycophants and yes-men, adored by the public and feared by his competitors. But now she saw a man who had lost everything: his power, his respect, his control. She had known this moment was coming, but seeing it in person still felt surreal. Her heart was heavy, not with triumph, but with the quiet realization of how much had been lost in this game of power. Naomi took a deep breath and walked into the room. Her footsteps were deliberate, the click of her heels echoing in the silence. Griffin didn't look up. She stood in front of his desk, her posture straight, her face calm. "Griffin," she began, her voice even. "It's over." Griffin finally lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice raw. "I built this company from nothing. I built everything you're standing on. You think you can just tear it all down? You don't know who you're dealing with." Naomi stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're a man who used people, manipulated the system, and thought you were untouchable. But you've always underestimated people like Darius Langston, people who don't need to play your game, people who know the cost of justice and the power of truth." Griffin's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming faster. You were supposed to be loyal to me. You risked everything to bring Langston to the table, and now look where we are. You're no better than I am. You all are just using me for your own gain." Naomi's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. No, Griffin, you don't get to make that argument. You've been using people for years. Darius doesn't want revenge. He wants justice. He's giving you the chance to own your mistakes, but you're too stubborn to take it. Griffin stared at her, his eyes burning with anger. You think he's going to save you? You think anyone is going to care about your little ethics overhaul when everything I've built comes crashing down? Naomi's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. It's not about saving me, Griffin. It's about saving what's left of this company, what's left of the people who've been hurt by your actions. You destroyed their lives, and now you're the one who will pay the price. You've had your time. With those final words, Naomi turned and walked out of the room, leaving Griffin to stare at the empty space she'd occupied. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. Later that day, the board of directors of Stroud Dynamics convened for a special emergency session. They sat around a large, polished conference table, their faces grim, their eyes darting to the door as if expecting some kind of savior to walk in and rescue them from the mess they'd found themselves in. Griffin was absent, still holed up in his office, unable to face the inevitable. Naomi stepped into the room, her presence commanding attention. She didn't need to announce her arrival. Her reputation had already preceded her. Dressed in a simple but powerful black suit, she moved to the head of the table and sat down, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Let's be clear, she began, her voice calm but firm. Stroud Dynamics is no longer under the leadership of Griffin Stroud. Effective immediately, we will begin restructuring this company from the inside out. Our focus will shift to transparency, ethical business practices, and accountability. We will move away from the toxic culture that Griffin created. One of the directors, a middle-aged man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, leaned forward. And you think you can just take over everything now? We've built this company from the ground up. You think we'll just follow your lead after everything that's happened? Naomi met his gaze, unflinching. I don't expect you to follow me blindly. I expect you to do what's right. You've seen the evidence. You've seen the lives that have been ruined because of Griffin's actions. You've seen the damage he's caused. If you want to keep this company afloat, you'll have to change. And I'm the one who will lead that change. There was a long pause as the directors exchanged uncertain glances. One by one, they began to nod, reluctantly at first, but with increasing confidence as Naomi's words settled into their minds. All right, Naomi, one of the directors said. We're with you. Let's rebuild. Naomi's heart raced as she felt the weight of the moment. This was it, the beginning of something new, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be battles ahead, but for the first time, she felt like the company might actually have a chance at redemption. Meanwhile, across town, Darius Langston stood in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The skyline was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, but Darius wasn't looking at the view. He was thinking about what had just transpired. The fall of Griffin Stroud was inevitable, but it wasn't just about power or money. It was about something deeper. It was about justice. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Victor Reed answered after 2 rings. It's done, Darius said quietly. Victor's voice was calm but curious. What do you mean? The board's on board. Naomi's taken over. She's going to fix it. Victor paused for a moment. I hope she's ready for what's coming next. She is, Darius replied. And so am I. The Langston initiative is just beginning. As the camera panned out over the city, the words, "The end of one empire, the beginning of another," appeared on the screen. Message to the audience. If you've been moved by this story of justice, redemption, and transformation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue bringing these thought-provoking narratives to life. The journey for justice is just beginning, and we want you to be part of it. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories that challenge the status quo. Follow the channel for updates.